Hey, everybody, welcome back to Can I Have a Word, the podcast that explores language and its impact on our identity and the people we become. I am your host, Carl James, and I'm back with essentially part two of a previous episode. And so in the last episode, the word was reckoning, and I was talking about how I needed to grapple with certain aspects of my identity that I hadn't previously dealt with, settling the accounts, if you will, of who I was. And I was talking about my experience in Uganda and what it was like living there for a semester and encountering all sorts of new experiences. And in this episode, today's word is witness. Um, Now, typically we think of a witness as a person who sees an event or a crime or some sort of accident, someone who is present and able to observe something. Being a witness for me is more than seeing. It's about being present and truly taking in what's unfolding around you and carrying it forward. And so that really manifested itself in Rwanda. So as I told you, at the end of my our semester in Uganda, we traveled to Rwanda for this sort of 2-week evaluation period. And the main purpose of going to Rwanda was to have this evaluation, but we were also going to see the genocide memorials there. Now, for those who may not know, who have forgotten this horrific aspect of history, but back in, I think it was 1994, there was a horrendous genocide in Rwanda that resulted in the death of approximately 1 million Rwandans. It was a sort of tribal ethnic conflict that was, not to get into the politics, fueled in certain degrees by Western powers, but essentially it resulted in widespread bloodshed across the country over the course of about 3 months. And so when we went there, part of what we were going to witness, if you will, was the aftermath of these events. Now, this was some years later, obviously. And so it's not to say that, you know, you could tell that anything like that had happened. As a matter of fact, it was just the opposite. When we first arrived, I remember being struck by how peaceful and quiet it seemed. And we flew into the capital, but there was just a very quiet existence there. It was very peaceful, very tranquil, and I remember feeling very at ease there. But obviously, we knew that we were going to have to take in some very hard truths about the country and its history. And so on the day that we were supposed to visit these memorials, we knew that it would be emotional. And I had never been to a place like that. I didn't really know what to expect. Um, we were traveling in two buses. Our class was about 25 people, and we had a couple of uh, program leaders. So we were, I think, 30 in total. And so we traveled in two separate buses. I remember I was in the second bus, and just because of timing and other things, the first bus arrived about 20 or 30 minutes before us. And when my bus, the second bus arrived, I remember seeing some of my classmates who had already walked through this particular genocide memorial, and people were literally outside sobbing. And I remember thinking, this is going to be harder than almost anything I've ever done. This particular memorial, and I'm using the term memorial somewhat generously because it wasn't designed to be a memorial. Essentially, it was, I believe it was some sort of school or some sort of learning facility that was being built at the time of the genocide. And people essentially went there to hide. And as happens during a genocide, people were killed there. And so instead of removing all traces of what happened there, they decided to essentially leave it as it was. And so I remember walking up the steps and seeing this sort of almost kind of like an altar. You walked up the steps and then you walked into this room and there was an altar. And if you looked down on the ground, you would see bloodstains in the concrete that were still there. And on the altar, around the perimeter, they had pieces of people's tattered clothing strewn about the altar. So it was just like fragments of shirts and pants and whatever they could find. And it was just, bloodstained garments laying around. And taking that in as just sort of like the first like visual was a lot. And then as we progressed, there were subsequent rooms next to that sort of larger altar area. And so in these smaller rooms, they had set up essentially these wooden planks. And on these wooden planks were the skeletal remains of people who had been killed. And there's nothing that can really prepare you for seeing actual skeletal remains um, in that way and in that place. It was extremely emotional. Um, and your mind immediately tries to comprehend how something so horrific could have happened in a place that at the time that I was seeing it seemed so quiet and so peaceful. And the people who were taking us around the facility were people who had actually survived the genocide. Um, and so they're talking about people in their community. They're talking about people who were, if they had family left, they're talking about people that they knew. And they described in pretty graphic detail in French through translation um, what it took for them to survive. And I remember there was a gentleman who talked about literally having to hide underneath dead bodies and pretending that he was dead also in order to survive. And again, you can't really believe that this is someone's actual story. Um, and they're telling it very matter of factly, and they're showing us these rooms, and they are doing it very sort of calmly. And the rest of us are, you know, a wreck, essentially. One of the last rooms at the school was a room of children. And sitting in, they were curled up in the fetal position. And some of them even had like small patches of hair left uh, on the remains. You could see it. And that was even the case with some of the adults. You could see like small patches of hair left. And it was just so raw and graphic. And, a lot of people were, sobbing or breaking down or they couldn't make their way through it. Um, and it was in that moment as I'm literally looking at the horrific remains of this awful period of history, bearing witness to what had happened here, where my sexuality really sort of came into my mind in the sense that during the genocide, people were killed because of their ethnic identity in part, whether it's the size of their cheekbones or the shape of their nose or things like that, but physical features that they could not control. And my thinking was that if these people were killed for just being who they were, if I don't think I'm going to suffer this fate, what right or what excuse do I have for not owning who I am completely? And that's a weird leap to take when you're looking at something so graphic in the moment, but that's where my mind went. I felt like I had a responsibility to be completely who I was and not shy away from that and not hide it because I didn't think I would suffer this type of fate. And that was really the moment when I decided that not only do I have to own my full identity in terms of my sexuality, but it's also time for me to let people know that this is who I am. And so that was the moment when I decided when I went back home that I was going to tell my family that I was gay. Um, that was a very emotional period for me. Um, and so, but it was pivotal to me being here today. And I think about that time often because it has made me who I am. And it's the reason why my sexuality and all of my various identities are so important to me because of what I saw when I was in Rwanda. And so when I think about the word witness, witnessing what had happened there shaped my understanding of truth telling. It was about recognizing the parallels between atrocity and speaking the truth about myself. Um, when you witness someone else's story, um, it allows you to more clearly see your own. Reckoning gave me the courage to face my truth, and witnessing taught me the responsibility of telling it so it can live beyond me. And so when I think about that, as well as all of the other stories that I tell in this podcast, that's really the crux of it for me. That's why it's so important because when you think about what happens in other parts of the world where people are suffering and don't have the freedoms that we enjoy here, I do feel a responsibility to own who I am and to tell my story fully so that maybe other people can feel encouraged or inspired by it as well. And so that is essentially my coming out story. It is an unconventional one, to say the least, but it is my story. I think even in, in these modern times, coming out stories still matter. And I think my story in particular, because it's so different from most people's coming out story, is also significant. And so that's why I wanted to share it. And so I'm going to leave it there. That was really heavy, but I think it helps you get to know me in a much more intimate way. And hopefully, um, it helps you understand kind of where I'm coming from and why I do this podcast and why I do the work that I do. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. And I will see you on the next episode of Can I Have a Word? Bye, everybody.